Hi everybody, I'm Wendy Adler and I'm your host for Articulating. Our talk today is going to be about Pointillism, which was a movement that was occurring kind of simultaneously with Impressionism, and sometimes it'll fall under Post-Impressionism, but it is its own movement and it's a really interesting one. We're going to talk about the art of the dot. So, Post-Impressionism basically means a period of time that came after Impressionism, of course. Impressionism occurred in around the 1860s with Claude Monet's painting Impression Sunrise, which we've talked about in previous lectures. That was the first time that artists were able to leave their studios, thanks to the portability of paints now being available, and they were able to go and paint plein air, which means in French, painting outside in the fresh air. So artists like Monet and Renoir and Degas would go outside of their studios with their easels on a beautiful summer day, just like we have here in Houston. They would set up outside and they would paint all day. Sometimes they would paint multiple canvases at once, such as Monet, who was trying to capture shadow and light and a moment in time with his works. That was why he did a lot of series paintings. Then we have other artists like Renoir, who was painting a lot of figures of people and friends that he had, also in outdoor settings. But then the Post-Impressionists were taking what the Impressionists were doing and moving a step further, and that's where our Pointillist movement comes into play. So Post-Impressionism is defined as a world that is dualistic, composed of two opposing tendencies: intuition, which is a life force, and intellect, which is resistance to that. That's a quote from Henri Bergson, who was a French philosopher. And Bergson was trying to point out the fact that art in post-impressionist time was either a scientific approach or a more emotional approach. Pointillism definitely falls into the more scientific approach, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Color theory was just starting to become popular. There had been some books written about it, and in fact, in 1879, there was a book called Modern Chromatics. And our primary pointillist artist, Georges Seurat, had read this Modern Chromatics tome and decided that it had such an interesting theory about it, that the science of how your eye plays with color and light, that was a very interesting idea to him. And so he decided to employ that into his painting. So before we delve deeper into the pointillist technique, let's talk a little bit about Georges Seurat, shall we? Georges Seurat was born in 1859. He died in 1891. He was Parisian. He did few but many large paintings. Most of the paintings that we have from Seurat are very large works, as you'll see in the ones we talk about. He wanted to be an artist, and his family said that that was okay, and so he was permitted to go study at the École des Beaux-Arts, which of course was the center of the art scene in Paris. He becomes an excellent draftsman. He likes to draw and make sketches of things, and this is going to serve him better later, as you'll see. And then he develops this theoretical system of painting, the pointillist technique. Sadly, Seurat dies at age 31 from meningitis, and so that's why we have so few of his works. So Seurat introduced this idea with his first major work called the Bathers at Azner, which we're going to study now. The Bathers at Azner is an oil-on canvas. It was done in 1884, and it's huge. It was a size that was really not done except for historical paintings up to this point. This one stands at 6.5 feet tall and almost 10 feet wide and hangs at the National Gallery in London. He painted it at age 24, and he based it on that color theory publication that I referred to earlier, the Modern Chromatics. So the color theory was this, that when complementary colors are placed next to each other, they will gain intensity and lose the power when they're mixed. What that meant was that Seurat was going to place small dots of colors, complementary colors, next to each other on his painting, and that the eye would fool your brain into seeing the color as he wanted it to be seen. So these minuscule dots, and our Bathers of Azner, it's not quite as apparent as some of the other works we'll talk about later. But these dots are all placed very closely next to each other, and your eye does the blending, not the artist. The dots are all about the same size, and they're placed strategically, and they almost create a shimmer, a term that we call chromoluminarism, which is a fancy word for shimmer. If you take a few steps back from these works, the technique vanishes, and it looks like large blocks of color as if they were painted normally, meaning the way that a painter would paint today. The figures take on a lifelessness almost to them. There's an artificiality to their character. Even though we have a lot of figures in the painting, and we'll have more figures in our next painting, they really almost look like statues. They don't have a whole lot of kineticism or movement going on. He did paint in his studio. He did not paint outdoors like his Impressionist buddies, but he would have been outside making a lot of sketches of what these bathers were doing and what the other subjects of his other paintings were doing. As I said, he was an excellent draftsman, so we do have a lot of sketches of these works. This was also not a spontaneous work. This was a very planned work that he made. And the subject would basically be a genre picture, meaning that he was painting a scene from the everyday. Okay, so let's talk specifically about our picture here, the Bathers at Azner. It took him almost a year to make this, and it was rejected from the Paris Salon. And so Seurat went off to exhibit with the Salon des Refusés. The Salon des Refusés, you might recall, were the Impressionist painters who the Paris Salon and critics had rejected. And so they went off and staged their own exhibition and rented their own exhibition space, which drew the interest of the public because it was so different. When Bathers at Azner actually had its New York debut in 1886, here's what a critic said about it. "This is a picture of coarse, vulgar, and commonplace mind, the work of a man seeking distinction by the vulgar qualification and expedient of size. It is bad from every point of view, including his own." So, the critic was not a big fan of Seurat at this point. So when we look at the work of this picture, we can see that there's some crosshatch brushwork and those dot patches that we talked about earlier. They're not quite as pronounced as they will be in our next picture, but you can definitely see that he laid those dots down in a very scientific and structured manner. The subject of this is, as we said, a genre picture, and it shows the working class on their day of rest, probably a Sunday, in a northwestern Paris suburb. Well, how do we know that these are the working class people? Well, we have lots of clues. For one thing, we have a few figures that are bathing in the water or swimming, right? And they have their shirts off. And someone from the upper class would never show their skin like that in public. So we can tell that these are not upper class people. These would be the working class people. We also can tell by their wardrobe. Their wardrobe is fairly simple, and the style of their hats would have been more in line with the style of a working class person. We don't have any women in this particular picture, it's just the menfolk. And in the background, we can see an industrial setting. We see factories and we see a smokestack. So that also gives us a clue of what he's showing us. We also have some shadows, so we can definitely pinpoint our light source, right? We can see that the light would have been coming from above in the upper right, shining onto the bodies and casting their shadows behind them. We also have one more clue here in this picture that's interesting. On the river we have a boat, and in the boat we can see an oarsman, or a gentleman with a pole, and some upper class patrons that are sitting in the boat for a lovely Sunday ride. And that's to emphasize that there are definitely two different classes. So why is he showing us the two different classes? Well, because Bathers at Azner ends up being a companion piece to our next work. Our next work, everybody's probably nodding their head right now because they all recognize it, is Sunday on La Grande Jatte. And there has been a Broadway musical written about this one. This one hangs in Chicago at the Art Institute, and so a lot of you may have actually seen it. Like the Bathers at Azner, it's also a very large work. It's about 6.5 feet tall by 10 feet wide. And when you see it in person, it's very immersive. This was actually painted after the Bathers at Azner, 1884 to 1886. And so it did take him a few years to put this one together. This one also was first exhibited in one of the Salon de Refusés exhibitions. It was actually the final exhibition held by that group of Impressionists, and it was in 1886. Now this picture also takes place on a bank of the Seine River, but you might note that it's on the opposite bank, and I'll show you a comparison of the two pictures together in a moment. So we had our working class bathers on the left bank, and we have our upper class society on the right bank. So what would all of these people have been doing on the right bank? They would have been out for a lovely stroll in the pretty weather. There were probably some restaurants and cocktail places. There were probably some vendors. It would have been like a stroll on a city walk these days, or on a boardwalk. In this picture, we have a very large foreground shadow, and that kind of pulls us into the picture. It messes with us a little bit as far as where our light source is, because it almost looks as if our light source is behind us when we're looking. These figures are also very stiff and static. There's nothing moving, there's no movement. There's also very little interaction in the figures, despite the fact that we have 48 people in this picture. But they're not interacting. Interesting, right? So again, he's used a very highly structured technique using those small dots next to each other, and he's arranged the figures for a pleasing composition. He would have sketched out these figures ahead of time. There are more than 60 sketches that we have of this particular work, pieces of this work. But he would have painted the entire thing in studio. It would have been way too big to be able to take it outside, of course, and paint plein air. And he would have had a difficult time, I think, standing in the studio and being able to place those dots and give himself the perspective that he needed for our eye to play that trick on itself, right? So he would have had to be doing a lot of walking back and forth and approaching the canvas and then walking backwards to make sure that his placement was correct. The figure stances in this picture are influenced by the Parthenon friezes in Athens, and so he's also nodding to a more classical form of art. There's no particular story or connection to these figures in the group, and in fact we can see a good example of that in the figures in the front left corner. We have those three figures. We have the man in the top hat, we have the woman, and we have the gentleman who's kind of lounging back on his elbows. But none of them are connecting. There's no narration. We would have to come up with our own story here. Seurat did kind of give us a little jab of satire here. The French verb to fish is pêcher, and the French verb to sin is also pêcher. And in the front, on the left, we have a woman standing on the bank of the river with a fishing pole. So we have a woman fishing, pêcher, and she's dressed in orange so that you would notice her, and maybe, just maybe, she was a courtesan or a prostitute, as in to sin, péché. We also know that these were upper class people because we see a monkey down in towards the center right. That would have been a fashionable pet for the upper class people to have. In this particular picture, as I said, we have 48 people, 8 boats, 3 dogs, and a monkey, and it would have been almost 3.5 million dots that he would have had to employ. So we talk about the two pictures together because they are companion pieces, even though they hang on different continents. We have, of course, the Grande in Chicago, and the Bathers are in the National Gallery. The Bathers hang in London thanks to Camille Pissarro, who was one of the colleagues of Georges Seurat. Pissarro's oldest son had seen Seurat's work and was a fan, and in 1924 he managed to convince the Tate to purchase the Bathers from a private collection, and that's where it still hangs today. So that talks a lot about Seurat's technique and his style. We can also see in this side-by-side comparison here that in the Sunday on Le Grand Jeté, Seurat framed his picture with different colored dots. We have kind of a thin frame that goes all around the circumference of red and blue dots. And I think, and this is just my theory, but I think he did that to emphasize the technique he was using. It really almost looks effortless, and when you think that he had to employ 3.5 million dots in order to get this effect, I think he wanted people to be able to recognize that. And maybe they didn't have the appreciation for the technique with the Bathers at Azner. And so I think maybe he was emphasizing that by employing that frame on the Grande Jeté picture. Next, let's move on to Paul Signac. Paul Signac was a colleague of Georges Seurat's. He was born in 1863, died in 1935, also a Parisian, came from a wealthy family. He had been exposed to the Impressionist works. He had seen the work of Claude Monet, was very impressed with that. And he was friends with Seurat, so they started to work together, and he really subscribed to Seurat's theory, the scientific theory of color. And they had met in the Rebel Society, they had exhibited together. Signac was also an enthusiastic sailor. Remember, he came from a wealthy family. He did join the Navy for a brief time, and often he would paint seascapes or maritime landscapes. And so we worked that into some of his works. In 1899, he wrote a manifesto called From Delacroix to Neo-Impressionism, because he wanted people to be able to start connecting the dots and see the trail or the path from the classic arts up to the movements of the day. Signac was responsible for Pointillism traveling outside of France because, as you recall, Seurat's work in New York was not well received. Signac actually moved to Saint-Tropez and started painting there. And as he traveled and as he moved around, he was able to basically blow the Pointillism horn and make sure people saw the technique involved. In this particular work, the Bonaventure Pine, painted in 1893, Signac is also employing the pointillist technique. This particular work hangs at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, so you may have seen it in person if you're here. This was painted when he had been in Saint-Tropez for about a year, and he was staying on the property of a Mr. Bonaventure. So he saw this pine tree on Bonaventure's property and painted it with the pointillist technique. He uses a little bit of an unrealistic color palette here, which actually helps us in seeing the placement of the dots. So it's the same technique Seurat uses, but he's a little more, not abstract, but a little more pointed in putting those dots down and making sure we know that that's the technique he's using. Those yellow highlights on the tops of the tree, that help us see that there's a reflection and that we're outside. And the points of color all converge into the form of that tree. And as I said, he was an avid sailor. We can see his, the water and the boats in the background there. But the nature, the sky and the tree both seem very outsized and immense in this picture. So this particular movement, the Pointillism movement, was part of Post-Impressionism. We also have a lot of other artists that kind of fall in this category or fall into their own isms. People like Paul Gauguin or André Derain, they both fall into Fauvism, but that's another lecture. We have Toulouse-Lautrec, who's doing some work during this time, and we have Cézanne doing some structural scientific color theory right now. But Cézanne, of course, is taking a much more geometric approach as opposed to the color theory approach that Seurat and Signac were using. The pointillist approach is a lot like the modern day pixels that we have today on computers or on television screens. So it is a term, if you said pixels when you were looking at these works, you wouldn't be wrong. It's a similar theory there. So our last artist today that I want to talk about is Yayoi Kusama, who is Japanese. She was born in 1929 and is still alive and working today. So more than 7 decades of work we have of Kusama's to be able to study and look at. So she is known as an avant-garde artist, which at the time that that term was employed meant a modern artist, someone progressive, somebody that was pushing the envelope and doing things that were very forward-thinking. Today, a lot of her work, to me, resembles pop art, and I'll explain that once we see those particular works I'm talking about. She came from a very wealthy family with very conservative parents, and because of this, her parents were not particularly supportive of her being an artist. She was kind of an inward person. She definitely needed a way to express herself, and she felt somewhat stymied and stifled by the fact that her parents were not willing to accept the fact that she liked to draw and express herself with art. So today, even, she references that she came from a hostile home environment. Society at the time was also a difficult place to be. There was a depression going on. We had come through World War II, and so the community was not particularly an uplifting source for her. She was also delusionary, and she hallucinated often. She made art obsessively, and this all led to a mental breakdown later. Her health was always a little bit precarious, but she actually committed herself to a mental asylum when she was in her 20s and 30s. She later came out of the asylum, as we'll see in a moment, but then she recommitted herself in 1977 and has lived in a mental asylum ever since. She has a studio set up across the street, and she does go and work every day, but she resides in the sanitarium of her own decision. So her early work, she was influenced by Surrealism. She, of course, was living during that time in the 30s and 40s when Surrealism was all over the place. And she struck up a correspondence with an American artist, and this may catch you a bit by surprise, but she struck up a correspondence with Georgia O'Keeffe. She and Georgia O'Keeffe began writing letters. Kusama had seen O'Keeffe's work in publications and had written her fan mail, basically, and O'Keeffe responded. And so Kusama sent her some work and some drawings that she had made, and O'Keeffe said to her, you know, you really should come to America, come to New York. Because after World War II, a lot of European artists had come to New York to seek refuge from the war. So New York was becoming a second art center, second to Paris. And so a lot of progressive avant-garde artists were working in New York. People like Mark Rothko and Jackson Pollock and Robert Rauschenberg and de Kooning. And so O'Keeffe said to Kusama, you should come to New York, see what other people are doing, take some classes and study with artists that are successful today, and let's see if maybe you can even find some New York or American representation in a gallery. So Kusama took her mentor's advice and moved to New York. She stayed in New York just for a couple of years, but she did indeed become represented by a New York gallery. I believe that that gallery relationship still holds today. And she also was exposed to the pop art movement, which may be why we see a lot of that in some of her work. She works very hard, but by 1973, she's back into her poor health, and so she returns to Japan because it's more familiar, and hopes that her success in the United States will lead her to perhaps some more success in her home country. She really isn't readily accepted there, even though she continues to paint and draw. And she does start to write poetry and publish text, which is starting to get noticed. To this day, she often will use excerpts of her text or her poetry to title or reference her work when it's hanging in a gallery or in an exhibition. She gains popularity in the United States not from when she first gets her representation, but really not until the 1990s, after pop art has become more readily acceptable and has hit the high-end markets here in the US. So, Kusama, 7 decades of work. She's done a lot of different mediums. She's done soft sculpture, she's done collage, she's done performance art, she's done video art, and she's also done rooms, which we'll talk about later. And her style does remain consistent regardless of which medium she's using. She uses a lot of the same icons. She uses things like pumpkins and polka dots and netting, or kind of these abstract, organic looking designs as background, which I'll show you. But she's also considered the master of modern day pop art polka dots, which is why I wanted to talk about her today. She incorporates polka dots into all forms of her work, and it's a recurring motif for her, whether she's using it on an object such as a pumpkin, which we're going to now see, or whether she's using it in one of her infinity rooms, which we will see in a little bit. She likes to pair those with biomorphic organic shapes, and the negative space, like her dots, can be a motif that pulls everything together. She had her first New York exhibition in 1959 when abstract expressionism was on the way out and minimalism was beginning to emerge. So she's still a modernist, and she's not really a minimalist, but she definitely is pushing the envelope as to the kind of art that she's doing. So why pumpkins? Because she definitely uses pumpkins a lot. Well, the pumpkins harken back to her family's nursery. Her family owned a plant nursery, and she always saw the pumpkin as being something that was instantly recognizable to all and generously unpretentious with a solid spiritual balance. That was a quote. The pumpkin also can stand for growth or fertility and abundance. But some people say that the pumpkins are somewhat sexual and erotic or even phallic. But of course, people say that about pretty much everything, right? So the pumpkin that I'm showing you here was painted in the 1980s. I love the way that she's used a very minimal color palette, right? She's only got kind of a fluorescent yellow set off with the black. She's got the pumpkin with dots of different sizes in a very specific pattern running up and down. And if you stare at the pumpkin long enough, the pumpkin almost seems kinetic because of the movement of those dots. Then she's got the pumpkin set against a black and yellow background, and the background almost makes reference to fishing nets. Well, of course, she's from Japan, and what's a huge industry in Japan? Fishing. So I think that she's really referencing things from her childhood with the pumpkin, things from her heritage with the Japanese fishing nets, movements of the time like pop art and minimalism. So she really does a good job of kind of tying all those things together. Here's what she says about the polka dot. A polka dot has the form of the sun, which is a symbol of the energy of the whole world and our living life. It's also the form of the moon, which is calm. Round, soft, colorful, senseless, and unknowing. Polka dots can't stay alone. Like the communicative life of people, 2 or 3 polka dots become movement. Polka dots are a way to infinity. I love that. Even though it's a long quote, I love that she's basically saying if you have one polka dot, it's really not a polka dot. Once you have a few polka dots together, then they actually might get grouped and called polka dot. And then once you have a lot of them together, it's like a congregation or a community of people. So I like the way she says that. She also makes reference to infinity, which is a nice lead into our next slide. This is a picture of one of her rooms. Remember I said she did a lot of different mediums, and she's known for creating infinity rooms. And an infinity room is basically an environment. It's considered installation art, and she has these infinity rooms in different variations in many, many museum locations around the world. Her first infinity room was done in 1963. And her first infinity mirror room, like the one pictured here, was done in 1965. If you've ever had the chance to go into one, hopefully my explanation is going to ring true to you. I have been in several of her rooms, and in this type of room, essentially you walk in, the door closes behind you, you're only permitted to stay there for a short amount of time because generally there's a line of people to get in. But it's a dark room. And once the door closes, you're standing in the dark and the lights slowly come up. And you battle with yourself as to where you are in space. You know, do you still have a sense of where you are? And then if you let yourself kind of lose yourself in the atmosphere, you can start thinking about things like fireflies or twinkling stars or just space generally. And it becomes so beautiful and disorienting, but not in an unpleasant way. So the rooms are really interesting, and they make the viewer a part of the art. You can definitely catch reflections of yourself in the mirrors, but you can't see yourself clearly because, of course, the room is dark. And it's a very intimate universe. Now, some critics say that there's an emptiness. Other critics might say that it's a little bit narcissistic because you put yourself in the middle of space. But to me, it was just something beautiful, and it was a wonderful experience. In 1990, she has her first American retrospective, and this revives interest in her work. So even though she's been around for 7 decades, it's really just been in the last 3 decades or so that her work has been very popular and exhibited frequently in America. In 1993, she's the first artist ever to be given a solo exhibition by Japan at the Venice Biennale. This is a big deal. This is like the Super Bowl of art exhibitions. And so in 1993, Japan finally embraced her as a significant artist from their country. Her most recent project was begun in 2009, and it was a series of 100 canvases that she posed to herself as a challenge to produce over an 18-month period. She titled this My Eternal Soul. Well, she liked it so much that the series now numbers at over 500 canvases, and she continues to add to it even now, 11 years later. It's lots of color. She uses square canvases. Both figurative and abstract things come into play, but you can still recognize it as Kusama's work because, of course, we see dots, which was the theme of today's talk. I thank you very much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this. Certainly subscribe to my YouTube channel if you'd like to be updated when I have more things to share with you. I hope everyone is staying well and staying safe, and I look forward to bringing you another talk soon. Take care.